I hope everybody is able to see my screen.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining. I hope everybody is having a good health in this pandemic period. So today's topic is about history of astrology in the west of Indian subcontinent. So history in general is believed to be a boring subject. In fact, I in schools generally don't like history much because in general history is more meant to be like a subject associated with memory. Like remembering years, remembering names, so all those things. But after when I learned astrology in 2002 and after started reading many other books, the understanding of history became very fascinating actually. And astrology as a subject has a very strong history, and understanding rich history of astrology will help us to paint a detailed picture of where we are today, and it will also give some amount of rationale on where we are going to head in the future. So to talk about the history of astrology, today we have Shri Aswin Subramanyan. So Ashwin has a master degree in finance and labor management. He have a full-time job in investment banking, and also Ashwin have a decade of experience in astrology. Aswin is not only strong hold in Vedic astrology, but also on Hellenistic and medieval astrology. So Aswin is also an author who wrote a couple of books. So you can get in touch with Ashwin through www.theabverdict.com. So without further delay, let me welcome Ashwin for this session. And Ashwin, you can take it from here.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to thank you and anyone who is along with you in organizing such good workshops every month. It's not a very easy thing, and it's a great thing that elders in your family, like your father, is being a guide to everyone. And thank you for sharing the knowledge and also helping everyone learn. So I'm sure many thousands of people will appreciate, learn, and share knowledge through innovative astro solutions. Let me just present the screen. Okay, so am I audible properly, or do we
Yes.
need any? Okay.
Yeah, you're audible, sir.
Okay, thank you so much. So many of us may have questioned why history of astrology in the west of the Indian subcontinent, but not why history of astrology in India. It's basically because Indian history is very vast and also extremely controversial, because a lot of it is not documented, and we have lost so many texts and historical records over the years because of occupations of Islamic invasion, and also because of the British rule, which took over us for almost 250 to 300 years, when we should have actually developed science and technology from our side. So it's quite unfortunate, but still the knowledge that we have is far greater than what any other civilization would probably have. That is our belief, but still some of them are controversial, and many Western historians have also distorted Indian history and facts of Indian history. So we really don't have a clear picture of what happened. It's and more importantly, India is very rich in oral tradition and not entirely in written tradition. So we have had a lot of transformation of knowledge by just through family lineages and through Guru Parampara, which is really not found anywhere else in the world. And the greatest thing is that we don't believe in books, and we still believe in learning from a guru, or learning from the most eldest person in the family. And the person who's organizing this knows me more than that, because I also come from a lineage. I learned astrology and various nuances of astrology from my grandfather. So, which is extremely important, and it's a precious gift for us to have in today's 21st century, because not many of them or not many other parts of the world have as such lineages as we have. So that's something that we have to address in the beginning. But history of astrology in the west of the Indian subcontinent is, let's leave out India, and anything that happened outside India and the west is what we are going to deal with today. I hope it will be interesting because there is a lot of I've not put in a lot of historical information of dates and times and all those things. We don't need to remember a lot of dates. We just this is going to be just an overview of who lived when, and we are going to give in terms of centuries and not exact years or something like that. So it will be a reasonably good overview. So once you move away from this session, or once the session is over, you will be able to have at least a bird's eye view of what happened with regards to historical transformation and transition of astrology in the west of Indian subcontinent. So that's basically what we are going to be dealing with here. So we are going to be seeing a lot of Greek astrology, the development of Greek astrology and pre-Greek astrology, and also a little bit of Persian development. And then from there, we will move on to Renaissance and modern traditions, which carries us through until today. So these are the contents that we will be discussing today. Pre-Hellenistic astrology, which is before the 1st century BC. Pre-Hellenistic astrology. So I'll probably take you through each and everything in a reasonably brief manner once we get to the slides. So pre-Hellenistic astrology is essentially about Babylonians and pre-Babylonian era. And Hellenistic astrology, we all know it's the Greek culture, the areas surrounding southern Europe and Mediterranean region, which stretches as far as Egypt, which is in the north of Africa. And then astrology, the Hellenistic form of astrology really flourished during the Roman Empire, and it becomes essential to talk about not necessarily about Roman Empire, but the fall of the Roman Empire, because it also marked the decline of Hellenistic astrology. And then it's very significant to deal a little bit about Sasanian Iran, and you will understand why it is when we go through it. And foundation of Baghdad. Foundation of Baghdad is the birth of Islamic Golden Age. So that's something extremely important in history. So I thought we should also cover that. And in order to make it a bit practical and not completely theoretical, I tried to fit in the electional chart or the Muhurta chart of the foundation of Baghdad. And so we can probably discuss about the chart in that particular portion of this presentation. Probably can be interactive, and we can share some of the insights that we see in the chart. So because I'm sure many of the people have many ideas when you see the chart. And Islamic astrology in Latin Europe. So this will carry us through from the foundation of Baghdad, and then Renaissance Europe, which is after the 15th century CE. Essentially, we are talking about regions surrounding the United Kingdom, and then psychological and esoteric traditions of the late 19th and the early 20th century, which is the 1880s to the early 1901 to 1920 or 1930, and then we will carry on from revival of ancient astrology and then astrology in the postmodern era. So the contents is large, but what we see inside is just snapshot of what the entire tradition was, because it is extremely difficult to cover everything in detail in just one presentation. So We will just see snapshots, and I'll give you some interesting information in various times in history, in each and every content or the subject that we're dealing with. So first, I just want to establish like what this talk is not about. So astrology has not been around for long enough. So sorry, it's been around for long enough. So, and we don't know when it really started. We don't know when Indian civilization really started. We don't know when Babylonian civilization really started. We don't know when Egyptian civilization really started. But we have facts and data that goes as far as 50,000 BC. It's 50,000 BC is something unimaginable, and recently I started reading a book by Graham Hancock, who's an archaeologist. In that he talks about a far more advanced civilization in the Amazon basin, which existed before 150,000 years ago. So this was found out when when deforestation happened in Amazon basin. When before deforestation, Amazon was a really dense forest, and once deforestation started happening, archaeologists and scientists made their way to Amazon basin, which stretches from the north of Brazil to Chile and other regions in Latin America. So it's hard to believe that astrology was not existing during those times, which arguably is arguably the most advanced civilization than what we have today. So they probably would have had astrology and even greater things during that time. So it's not about who practiced astrology first, or who founded astrology, or who laid rules for astrology, but it's mostly about reviving the texts of our ancestors and trying to share knowledge with each other, because we don't see any ego or any kind of debate among the ancient and the medieval astrologers in terms of sharing knowledge, because the Greeks learned from the Babylonians, and the Babylonians probably learned from the Assyrians, and Assyrians probably learned from the Chaldeans. And we are already talking about 8,000, 7,000 BC. So it's really not about who found astrology and who practiced astrology first. So, and it's more easier in today's world, where we are finding access to a lot of texts in various languages, including Sanskrit, Latin, and ancient Greek. So, and let's not forget Parsi and other Islamic languages of the medieval era as well. So there is a lot of things that historians are finding out, and translators are finding out, and they're translating the texts from various languages such as Greek, Latin, and Arabic. So any historical notion or fact that we think is an actual fact might easily be proved wrong in another 3 or 4 years when another new text comes out. So there can never be a dogmatic statement about the history of astrology in terms of who practiced first or who found the technique first. So it's just going to be like learning and imparting knowledge as far as we can, because that's how the entire astrology was always transmitted, and that's the only reason we still have today. So instead of going and arguing about or taking ownership of whatever form of astrology, I think we should just learn and share. So that is something that I wanted to establish before we get into the actual content. So the first thing that we'll talk about is pre-Hellenistic astrology, that is before 2nd century BC. Let's get into a little bit of Indian history, where we will see Lord Rama's chart at some point of time in this lecture. But we will also see how astrology existed in India in a brief manner. But we all believe and we all understand, and there is no debate on the fact that astrology existed in India during the days of Ramayana and Mahabharata. But the same thing also happened in the West, in the regions surrounding the ancient Babylon and Mesopotamia, which is essentially modern day Iraq. So, like Indians, the Babylonians and Chaldeans and Assyrians also gave meaning to planetary movements that is happening in the sky, and they associated the celestial movements in the sky with various happenings or events in the world. What we are talking about is essentially mundane, and during those times, at least we don't have proof so far to say that horoscopic astrology was practiced in the Babylonian culture or the Chaldean culture. But astrology was essentially more omenology, which we call in India shakunas. So shakunas, in simple words, whenever we are expecting an answer for something, or when we have a question in our mind, when we hear or when we see, or when we observe something that is happening in the environment, it provides a symbolic answer to the question. So to answer it very simply, a friend actually called me and asked, we were looking for a synastry of matching a horoscope for his marriage. So he sent me, and I just checked, and I didn't even say it was okay. But when I just called him to say that the compatibility was okay, he was in the temple, and we heard the bell in a temple ring. So I didn't even answer him the question, but that is probably the omen that he had, or that is probably the symbolic answer that he had in terms of what the answer from me is going to be. So, which essentially ended up in his marriage. But until the end of the day, I didn't tell him anything. I just disconnected the call, saying that I think we already have the answer. But I told him that you have the answer, just go ahead with it. And at the end of the day, I called him and I told him that I did not give you the answer, but I let the temple or the bell that rang in the temple give you the answer, which is one of the best examples of shakuna or omens that we can associate with. So this was how astrology was treated, and this was how people found out and gave meanings to various celestial happenings using symbolic answers in the environment. And it is also proven, and we have proof that astrology existed. I mean, the recording of celestial movements in the sky existed, and the planetary positions were noted by the ancient people in Babylon. So that's one thing. And then astrology was essentially mundane, so we still don't know whether it was used for horoscopic purposes or for individuals. That's what I mean to say by meaning horoscopy. So we are pretty much not sure whether it was used for individual horoscopes before 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, but it is pretty much sure that ancient Babylon and Mesopotamia had universities for astrology and omenology during the 7,000 and 8,000 BC, and they would found various reports about various celestial happenings, and they would present it to the king, so that the king would make decisions based upon the reports provided by the astrologers. So what essentially would have happened is, like, the astrologers would have noted a specific transit that's happening in the sky, and then they would have presented the report to the king, and the king, because astrology was mundane during that time, the king would have probably decided what is good for the kingdom and what is bad for the kingdom. So based on that, he would have acted. So that's all this is extremely fascinating. If you can record the celestial movements in the sky, and if you can run a kingdom before 6,000, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, I don't know what we are still doing today, doing all this scientific research without using astrology to its greatest potential, not to demean science or something. We have still we have made great inroads in terms of scientific development and technological development, but still I think we should probably use astrology to that effect as the ancients and the pre-ancients used in terms of running their kingdoms. So that's essentially what I've written here in the slide. I'll just read the last portion. Astrology in Mesopotamia and Assyrian era was believed to be an astral divination, and the priests took the planetary movements and various signs of nature as omens. These omens usually had some meanings which might either represent or indicate past, present, or future. So this is the pre-Hellenistic astrology, that is before we had paper and pen in terms of how people recorded the celestial events. That's basically what pre-Hellenistic astrology was. And so before going into the orange part of what I've written here, let me just explain you who are Chaldeans and who are Beroses. Okay, who is Beroses? So Chaldeans are a group of people who existed from the 10th century BC to 6th century BC, and later became part of Babylonia. There they shared science and philosophy of their culture and amalgamated with the Babylonians to further the contribution to mankind. So Chaldeans are one of the most, Chaldean civilization is one of the most advanced civilization that we had in the ancient era, where they gave the knowledge of, they probably gave knowledge of the zodiac, but they divided it into 36 divisions, which we call as decans or decanates or drakanas today. But Jyotish drakanas are a bit different, but in Jyotish, we give drakana rulerships to the trines, but in Chaldeans, it's a little bit different. So the Chaldeans gave the order of planets based upon the speed. So Saturn is the slowest planet. I'm just talking about the visible planets and not the nodes or the Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto. So based upon the speed in which they come around the sun, they gave the planetary order where Saturn comes first. Saturn is the slowest, Jupiter is the next slowest, followed by Mars, Venus, Mercury, Sun and the Moon, so on. So this is how the order of planets was derived by the Chaldeans, and we still use the Chaldean order of planets in various techniques in astrology. The book that I recently published also is based upon the Chaldean sequence of Chaldean planetary sequence. So, and the decans that the traditional Western astrologers use today is also based upon the Chaldean decans. So the knowledge of zodiac was existing, and they divided the zodiac into 36 signs and gave meanings based upon various figures that they could work with. So, and Beroses, let's talk about Beroses. Beroses was so just to close Chaldeans probably lived with the Babylonians towards the end of their civilization, and they amalgamated with the Babylonians, and they shared the knowledge with Babylonians, and in turn the Babylonians shared their knowledge with the Hellenistic astrologers who wanted to consume knowledge of astrology from the Babylonians. So Beroses was a writer and an astronomer in the early Hellenistic era who was associated with the late Babylonian era. So we see the correlation that I just spoke here, like the pre-Hellenistic era, which is before, which is around 400, 300 BC. They kind of the civilization of the Babylonians and the early Greeks or the early Hellenistic people came into one culture because of various civilizations being invaded during that time in history. So Berosus was one of those unique figures who had this access to both Babylonian and Hellenistic tradition. So whatever knowledge that he had in terms of the Babylonian astronomy and astrology, he imparted to the early Hellenistic astrologers, and he was one of the priests he was one of the priests, and he wrote various texts on astronomy and astrology and omenology or whatever it may be, and he transmitted astrology to the early Hellenistic astrologers. Probably some of the early Hellenistic astrologers such as Nechepso and Petosiris. We will see Nechepso and Petosiris in a short while, but and the image that you see here, right, is the cuneiform tablets. This was the pre-paper era that we're talking about. So anything was basically recorded on cuneiform tablets. So I don't recognize these symbols or scriptures, but this is an example of cuneiform tablet, and I don't even know what is written here, but I got it from one ancient history website. So just to give an idea of what cuneiform tablets look like. So the Chaldeans, whom the policy of the kings of Antioch. So Antioch is a region which is in modern day Turkey. Antioch is an ancient city. So the Chaldeans, whom the policy of the kings of Antioch strove to conciliate, entered into close relations with the learned men who came to Asia in the train of their conquerors, and they even proceeded to carry their precepts throughout the land of Greece. A priest of Berosus established himself about the 280 BC in the island of Kos, and there revealed to his skeptical hearers the contents of the cuneiform writings accumulated in the archives of his country, annals of the ancient kings and astrological treatises. So we know that ancient history is all about conquests and invasions and rulerships. But the good thing is, like, people just did not rule, but once they started ruling a specific group of people, they also consumed knowledge and they preserved knowledge. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of knowledge from Berosus or probably a lot of ancient Greece as well, because of passing time in history. But still, we have cuneiform tablets that are present in various archaeological institutions, and also many libraries and many universities, or the libraries of the universities in Europe. So somehow we have a little bit that survives from the pre-antiquity era. So do we have any questions so far?
Yeah, I think Ashwin, you can proceed.
Okay.
We can have Q&A at the last also.
Okay, at the last. Okay, no problem. Okay, fine. Okay. Is it okay if we have a little bit of interaction during the foundation of Baghdad thing? If it is possible, we'll do it. Otherwise, I can just continue.
No, we can have interaction.
Okay, sure.
Some of the people already have some background about astrology, so we can have interaction.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, thank you. So we just saw about pre-Hellenistic astrology. Now we'll just correlate things with Hellenistic astrology and see what is interesting in Hellenistic astrology. Okay, it's difficult to talk about Greece or Hellenism or Hellenistic astrology or Greco-Roman astrology without the influence of Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle. I've just included these three Greek philosophers, but there are so many Greek philosophers who have contributed, philosophers or scientists or polymaths or whosoever it may be. But I think the foundation of the Greek culture and the the essentiality and the fundamentality of the Greco-Roman or the Hellenistic astrology is largely built upon the teachings of Socrates and later on Plato and Aristotle. It also carried through to the medieval Islamic tradition of astrology as well. So it becomes essential for us to know a little bit about the history. So Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle together form an identity just for Greece, but their influence does not stop just with Greece, because ancient Greece existed before 1000 BC, or probably even before that, I'm not sure. But at least from 1000 BC, we have had people who have documented science and philosophy, and we know Pythagoras or Pythagoras, who was a great astronomer and mathematician in the 7th and 6th century BC, whose influence is still present across the world in terms of mathematics and trigonometry. And so the philosophies of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, it's not just the philosophy of how to live life, but it is also how to exist and how to coexist on Earth as a human being. And they did not just contribute towards philosophy, but they also contributed towards science through their philosophy. And just like how the ancient sages of India spoke about the scientific, atmospheric, and various other compositions of planets and other celestial, whatever celestial things of the sky, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle also, especially Aristotle, gave a lot of insights into how the world or the earth is perceived, or how science is essential for human existence on earth. So because the Greek culture or ancient Greek civilizations always involved in invasions of other regions, the philosophy of not just these three people, but various other philosophers and ideas of the people from the scientific community of ancient Greece and Rome traveled everywhere along with the invasion of the Greek people in various places across the world, and it stretched as far as Egypt, because we'll see why Egypt in due course. But Alexander, as we know, who is part of the Macedonian kingdom, stretched as far as India, but he could not completely take over India. That's a different story. But the philosophy of the Greeks did not stop with Greece and Mediterranean region, but it stretched towards the east as far as Asia. So when we talk about the Greek culture or the Roman culture, it's essential to know that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, along with many other Greek philosophers, contributed to the growth of the civilization and the foundation, the very foundation of the people that lived during that time. Because we had a lot of schools in ancient Greece and ancient Rome and other adjacent territories surrounding the Mediterranean region in the southern Europe. So, and many philosophers taught thousands and thousands of young Greeks and Romans in the schools that existed in 500, 400, 300 BC. Schools founded by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are all before 4th and 3rd century BC. So, but these people always have had to move from one place to another because of political insensitivities. But the good side is that as and when they moved, they started educated people wherever they move. So that is the greatest takeaway from the invasions that happened in the pre-ancient and the ancient era. So when we talk about ancient era or the antiquity, it's essentially from 2nd century BC to the 5th or the 6th century AD. So the foundation of the Hellenistic culture and civilization was completely based upon the works of early Greek philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Platonistic philosophy became the influence of the works of early Hellenistic astrologers, while the Neoplatonic philosophers like Plotinus had an influence in the later Hellenistic astrologers. So Plotinus is one of the most important people who wrote the work called Enneads. Enneads. If you want to search for the work, it's called the Enneads, which is one of the most important metaphysical books that talks about that not only talks about various other metaphysical things that exists or that we believe exists in the world, but it also talks about the impact or influence of the stars on the earthly events and individuals as well. So if you're interested in some of the works of the Greeks, I think especially that is related to astrology, you won't find direct astrology, but you will find how astrology was developed and how the universe was perceived if you read Plotinus. So in that case, I would surely recommend Plotinus, because if Plotinus kind of gives the philosophical overview of the development of Hellenistic astrology from the early 1st century BC through the 5th or the 6th century AD. So, and Aristotle is one of the most important astrologers. If Aristotle has specifically written a work called Metaphysics. Aristotle has so many works, but one of his works is Metaphysics, where he talks about the lot of metaphysical elements. Astrology is one of the metaphysical elements. He also does not directly talk about astrology, but he talks about the influence of the metaphysical elements on Earth and the earthly beings. And Aristotle's philosophy, or it is called as Aristotelian ideologies or philosophies, influenced not only the Greek astrologers, but more so the Islamic astrologers and the fundamental idea of Islam and its culture itself. So the most of the early Arab or the Islamic astrologers had this access to Aristotle through some of the late Greek works from 3rd, 4th, or probably the 5th century, and they kind of defended astrology almost as a scientific phenomenon, which we'll talk about later when I talk about the medieval period. But at least 600 or 700 years before, Claudius Ptolemy, one of the most influential figures in the history of astrology, defended astrology as a scientific phenomenon, because you should know that astrology was always attacked even during the antiquity or the ancient era, that it is not an actual scientific phenomenon, but it is. Claudius Ptolemy, in his work called Tetrabiblos, Tetrabiblos, in his work called Tetrabiblos, he presents astrology in the most scientific manner possible. And his other important astronomical work, based on which various tables for medieval astrology was constructed, is called as Almagest, Almagest. It's one of the most important contributions to the astronomy from the ancient era, which is considered to be the most fundamental work even today. So the Ptolemaic ideologies are still extremely important to us, and although Ptolemy from the he lived in the 2nd century AD, so even though he's not considered to be the most mainstream Hellenistic astrologers, Ptolemy is one of the most important and significant astrologers who lived during the Hellenistic times. And he's not just an astrologer, he's an astronomer. He has written works on geography, he has written works on music theory, he has written works on ophthalmology, if you can imagine, ophthalmology in 2nd century CE. So what I've said is just few things, or probably 10% of Ptolemy has done. So he's a polymath, and there is really or probably there is nothing that Ptolemy has not done. So it's important and it's worth enough to go and check Ptolemy if you like. So Alexandria, Hellenistic Egypt. So Alexandria is a city which is in Egypt, and it exists even today, and it is one of the most although Alexandria is not the capital city of Egypt today, today's capital of Egypt is Cairo. But despite the fact that Alexandria has gone through a lot of changes since its discovery, in somewhere in the 4th century. I think it's around 334 BC or something, when Alexander found Alexandria, and it remained as one of the most important cities. Although it kind of Alexandria is at least 2,500 years old, the charm of Alexandria is still pretty much present. And the shore of Alexandria, the seashore of Alexandria, is still extremely busy and one of the busiest in the entire world. And the very sea route of and the seashore of Alexandria was one of the most significant seashores, which turned out to be a trade route, and the major route of the ancient, and the connection between the East and the not necessarily the East, but the African and the Western world. And from Alexandria, we could also reach various ports in ancient ports in India, like Cochin and Korkai, which is modern day Thoothukudi. So it's extremely fascinating to see Alexandria and its relations to various other places in the history of the world. That's out of scope of this lecture, so I'm just closing it. So, but still, Alexandria, in 332 BC, Alexander conquered Egypt, which gave rise to Hellenistic Egypt. So before we go into various other things, it's important to understand why Egypt is Hellenistic Egypt, because the Macedonians and the Greeks conquered Egypt, and they kind of mixed with the existing Egyptian civilization in Egypt during the 4th century BC. And Egyptians already had a great scientific and astrological tradition going. As you know, I spoke about the Chaldeans and the Babylonians. So they had access to Alexandria and Egypt, and they already mixed with the Egyptian civilization. And the coming of Hellenistic people, or the Greeks and the Romans, from the west to northern Africa and Egypt, kind of paved way for the amalgamation of various cultures, and science, technology, including astronomy and astrology and mathematics, started growing by leaps and bounds from the 4th century BC, after the foundation of the city of Alexandria in Egypt. And the Library of Alexandria, if you can see the picture here, this is a pictorial representation of the Library of Alexandria. So the Alexandria, because of its inclusiveness and wide variety of culture and settlements of various people, it turned out to be the scientific hub. So what happened was, from 4th century BC through to the 2nd or 3rd century, Alexandria for 700 or 800 years remained the scientific hub. So the most interesting thing is that any port that comes to Alexandria will have to stay in Alexandria for various needs, such as food, water, or any other consumption for people who are traveling in the ship. And if they have to travel further east, it is very necessary to kind of stop there in Alexandria and see what they need for their further travel. So what happens is like any text, the scientific text that comes to Alexandria will have to be in Library of Alexandria, and they will make a copy, and only then the ship can leave the shore. So the thing is like ships from across the world reached Alexandria, and the Alexandria is a mix of people from various cultures. So they probably knew many ancient languages such as Sanskrit, ancient Greek, ancient or pre-classical Latin, and even early Persian or Hebrew or whatever it may be. So any text that came from any civilization stopped in Alexandria, and a copy was made. Only then a copy was made, and it was saved in the Library of Alexandria. It was preserved there, and only then it was allowed to the ship was allowed to sail further. So this enabled Alexandria to be the hub. So there was really no text that you cannot find in Alexandria that is available somewhere else. So if you go to Alexandria, the text is probably available. Any text that you want is probably available. So the Alexandria, the Library of Alexandria is not as it was before. So many texts are lost. But there is a movement that is happening today, which is called as the digitalization of the Alexandrian Library, where people are digitalizing a lot of manuscripts and texts from centuries ago, probably before 2000 years, and they're just saving it in digital manner. So it's been going on for many years, like probably more than a decade. So still they're unable to complete it, and it is an ongoing project. So you can imagine how many texts are still lying in the Library of Alexandria, which includes astrology as well. So and coming to astrology, the essential part of astrology of the Hellenistic tradition was developed in Egypt and not in Greece or Rome or any Western region in the world. So it was Egypt, and many astrologers traveled to Hellenistic Egypt to find the source text in the Library of Alexandria and to amalgamate with the Egyptian people who already had knowledge of astrology, and the Greeks who traveled and settled in Alexandria or Egypt further developed the tradition of astrology, because it was very difficult for people to travel from one place to another during the ancient times, and it's not often that people can travel. So maybe once a war is over and once the people settle down in one place, they might probably not move somewhere else, and they will consider the place where they settled down as home. And that is one of the reasons why Alexandria was extremely rich, because it amalgamated cultures and developed astrology. And we still have many thousands of astrological texts that are untranslated in the Library of Alexandria, which probably includes Sanskrit texts as well. So once Alexander founded the Library of Alexandria, one more important point to mention here is that Alexander learned, he was a student of Aristotle. So once he conquered Egypt and founded the city of Alexandria, his rule made everything possible to make Alexandria the greatest city of the ancient world. And knowledge was transmitted, like decans were already known to the Egyptians and the Babylonians. So the Greeks inherited some of the horoscopic knowledge from the Babylonians and the Egyptians, and the 12 sign horoscopy was also existing in the Babylonian region. So all this was made available to the Hellenistic philosophers and scientists and astrologers during the ancient period, and they further developed the astrology, and this particular tradition of astrology turned out to be called as Hellenistic astrology or Greco-Roman astrology, because it was developed by the ancient Greeks who had traveled to Hellenistic Egypt, and once they studied the source texts from the Babylonians, probably they might not have had a lot of texts, and it would also be not fair to say that the Greeks inherited all of the texts from the Babylonians or the Egyptians, but they furthered the idea of astrology and the idea of zodiacal signs, the idea of planets, and and gave rise to a system of astrology which was called as Hellenistic astrology. And the 12-fold sign system called as horoscopic astrology was probably first used for individuals in the Hellenistic era, somewhere before, somewhere in the 1st century BC. So I hope this this gives a fair idea of Hellenistic Egypt. Okay, so before knowing many other things, I think it is important to know the philosophical underpinnings. But what is philosophical underpinnings is that we all know that Jyotish is based upon the idea of karma and reincarnation. So the karma is probably the underlying factor of the Vedic astrology and the Vedic civilization. We all believe in karma or some form of karma, and we all believe in reincarnation. So we don't believe that this is the only form of life that we have that we are living through today. We believe that something was in the past, and we also believe that something was in the future. This is not very different from what the Greeks had thought as well. So I just wanted to I just wanted to state a few things from the Greek tradition in terms of philosophy and how astrology is perceived, because there is a lot of debate that's going on in the modern world about the fate and free will, but there was not much to debate about in the ancient times regarding the idea of fate or free will, because a lot of things were deterministic, and we will see why it is deterministic. So Chris Brennan, in his book Hellenistic Astrology, the Study of Fate and Fortune, pointed out the 4 major philosophical issues in astrology, that is signs, causes, complete determinism, and partial determinism. Science is something that I spoke to you about, that is a symbolic answer from the world itself, and we probably don't need to look at a lot of planetary movements or something like that. So causes is basically like believing that a planet has caused something like this on Earth, or a planet has caused something like this to this person in his life, or caused an event in his life. And complete determinism is all about thinking that things are entirely fatalistic and everything is predetermined. So if Jupiter is in the 8th house, it is something is predetermined. You're going to work with other people's money. You're going to work with the deep occultism, and you're going to know about a lot of shastras. If Saturn is in the 8th house, you're going to face sorrowness. You're going to learn astrology. You're going. So all this is predeterministic attitude. So that is called as determinism. So anything. So if Mars is in the 7th house, we would be forced to believe that spouses are aggressive, and we face some kind of an issue because of the spouse that is related to the Martian tendencies and all those things. And partial determinism is not entirely believing in what this a particular placement of a planet or in a sign causes, but it is also to exercise some kind of a human quotient to exercise a specific choice in life. So these are all not just words, but these are developed based upon various philosophical ideologies of the ancients, such as Stoicism and Platonism or Aristotelianism, or all those things. It's difficult for me to get into the ideas of all these philosophical fundamentalisms, but I think it is worth mentioning that there was many different ideas in the ancient Greek culture as well, that the people who developed astrology or horoscopic astrology in Hellenistic Egypt followed. So I'm just quoting Aristotle's On the Universe, which is translated by E.S. Forster. On the Universe is one of the works that's done by Aristotle, which gives us an idea of how Aristotle perceived this universe to be. So the upper portion of the universe, a whole with a fixed upper limit everywhere, the home of the gods is called heaven. This is not much different from what we perceive. So heaven is full of divine bodies, which we usually call stars, and moves with an eternal motion, and in one circular orbit revolves in stately measure with all the heavenly bodies unceasingly forever. So the heaven is always moving, it is eternally moving, and it does not stop. So when the earth is rotating, so the sun is always staying in one position, but the earth is rotating. So when the earth reaches the east, we say that sun rises in the east, but actually earth rotates and it moves to the eastern direction, and then goes to the midheaven or the culmination, and then comes down at the setting point of descending, and then the anti-culmination, which is moving below the horizon, which is essentially the midnight. So this does not stop. And the heavens, we also know that heaven is full of gods and devatas, and the devas or the gods are all living in the heavens, and they keep blessing the people on earth. So it's a natural tendency for us to pray the God by looking somewhere in the sky, if there is no actual idol or a poster in between us, in front of us. So this is not so different from what the Greeks thought, or it's all the same. So I tried to explain here what is written here. So from an astrological sense, so although astrology began as a symbolic field of study, it was turned into a cause and effect phenomenon. So Ptolemy bases the idea of human itself in the same way that the universe is perceived by Aristotle. Across all traditions, body is just a material and carries outward appearances, while the soul is omnipresent and based upon human experiences. The bodily figure of a human and his mind changes over time and becomes a specific being on this earth, which is one of those millions that Aristotle mentioned that the earth hosts and contains. So astrology is essentially and inherently symbolic, and we cannot deny that, because there are so many symbolisms that we can associate. For example, if when a planet is placed in the 12th house, and if that planet is activated by a specific dasha or a bhukti, the particular there will be some kind of an end to something in our life, not essentially an end of the person or end of the loved ones or end of something. Let's not even go so deep. It's just the end of something. So maybe you were probably having a habit of writing diary, but you stopped it when something that's during the 12th house period. So here the symbolism is that, or the symbolic answer is that 12th house is the end of the Bachakra or the zodiac. So it symbolically signifies or signals something that is going to end, and regardless of whether it is good or bad. So it's there will be some kind of an end to something that we have been doing so far in our life. So with this, we can say that astrology is a symbolic field of study, and cause and effect phenomenon is it's easy for us to associate the cause and effect phenomenon. If Mars aspects Venus, and if when a person gets a divorce, we can easily we not easily, but we tend to conclude saying that this person is getting a divorce because Mars and Venus are in aspects. So, or if Mars and Venus are in opposition, if Venus is in Scorpio and Mars is in Taurus, there is an exchange, but still it is an opposition, and it is a little bit of a difficult aspect with Mars aspecting Venus. So if there is something that is problematic with the relationships of a person, we tend to conclude based upon this aspect between Mars and Venus, if they are related to the seventh house or if they are not related, because both are, Venus is somehow related to marriage and partner or spouse. This is cause and effect phenomenon, and like how the heaven is one thing, and universe is one thing, and all the beings of earth are part of the universe and the heavens that is above us. The nativity or the birth chart is a round figure within which we place the planetary positions at birth, and it is a perfect picture of how the life is going to be, and our entire life can be basically we can just put it in like putting genie into the bottle. It's very difficult, but still it's far more easier than what the context is. The life, we can easily put it into a natal chart or a nativity. Anyone who knows astrology, not believes, because astrology is not a belief, it's knowledge. So anyone can practice or do astrology. So anyone who knows or studies astrology will surely understand that it is easy to put a native's life inside a nativity or a birth chart. So that's basically what Aristotle says, and that's what the philosophers or the astrologers from the Greece have. That's how they related with astrology. And another thing is like the one more similarity that we can find with the Indian philosophical tradition and the Western philosophical tradition here is that the idea of soul. The idea of soul is omnipresent. Soul is Atma, and it's omnipresent. And it neither has the beginning nor does it have the end. It does not have any change, and it does not have any evolution. It is just one thing that is called soul or Atman, where it just travels from one physical, not even body, but just one physical form to another physical form. And that's basically what the Westerners or the Greeks believed as well. So if you read the Republic, you will know that the Greeks also believed in the idea of reincarnation. The Republic, Plato's The Republic is available very cheaply on Amazon, and I think there are free copies on the internet as well. So if you read the Republic, you will find it is no different from the idea of reincarnation that Krishna says to what Plato says in the Republic. So there is no argument whether or not Plato said first or Krishna said first, but let's just believe that both of them said the same thing. So again, relating it to astrology and presenting it with a scientific notion, and also to put in the cause and effect phenomenon, we have to see the final paragraph that I've given here. The character then of the inquiry into bodily affections would be of this sort: of the qualities of the soul, those who concern the reason and the mind are apprehended by means of the condition of Mercury observed on the particular occasion, and the qualities of the sensory and irrational part are discovered from the one of the luminaries. Luminaries are the sun and the moon, which is the more corporeal, that is the moon, and from the planets which are configured with her in her separations and applications. So let's not get into so much of technical aspects to this, but Ptolemy makes it exceedingly clear that the qualities of the soul are affected by the planetary conditions in the nativity. So in this case, he mentions that condition of Mercury needs to be observed to identify the quality of the soul as Mercury. He also states that sensory and irrational part are decided upon the luminaries. So Mercury, we all know that it is an analytical planet and signifies analytics, and it signifies logic and rationalism. But on the other hand, for some of the most uh, irrational things, we always associate with the moon, because moon is more emotional, and emotion does not understand logic. So Ptolemy beautifully makes a statement that he also states that sensory and irrational part are decided based upon the luminaries. So I give more importance to the moon, but Ptolemy thinks that sun should also be taken into consideration, which is very obvious. Sensory and irrational both are associated with the moon, because the moon is the irrational mind, while Mercury is the rational mind. So here we know that placement and condition of Mercury or the moon gives an answer as to what the quality of the soul is. Quality of the soul is nothing but the quality of the physical form of the human, that the soul has uh, taken residence in a physical form. So we have to see the moon and we have to see Mercury to see what is happening with specific things that are connected with the moon and Mercury regarding the quality of a person's life. So I hope this is clear. So let's just move on to the next slide.
So you have any questions, Sheshachalam sir?
Just wanted to congratulate the level of explanation what he is giving now today. I am very blessed to have such a fantastic oration. Thank you very much, Ashwin Ji. God bless.
Thank you so much. So we already spoke about astrology and divination in early Hellenistic Egypt, where I just covered a lot of things when we spoke there. So ancient Egypt was not just indigenous Egyptians. We already know that various civilizations came in as a result of conquests from various regions over Egypt. So Chaldeans, Babylonians, and Greeks made their way into Egypt, and the city of Alexandria turned out to be a hub of the ancient age, where all sorts of knowledge was documented, preserved, shared, and sometimes secretly buried, which is something that I did not tell you. It's secretly buried, and it has happened across civilizations. We cannot deny that Indians did not bury or did not keep things secretly. Indians obviously kept a lot of things secretly, and they did not disseminate or spread knowledge, some of the knowledge, to everyone. Like that, we already have a lot of things that happened in the ancient world concurrently with the Indian ancient world as well. So it's not new. About the year 150 BC, there were composed in Greek, undoubtedly at Alexandria, the mystic treatises attributed to the fabulous king Nechepso and his confidant priest Petaurus, which I spoke recently about, became, as it were, the sacred books of the growing faith in the power of stars. These apocryphal works of mythical antiquity were to acquire incredible authority in the Roman world. So 150 BC was probably when the entire astrology of the ancient Greeks had started to unfold. Obviously at Alexandria, because Alexandria was the major scientific hub. So Nechepso was a king of a specific region, and Petaurus was a priest and one of the most trusted people in by Nechepso. Petaurus was one of the most trusted people by Nechepso, and he had written many works, and he had grown faith in the power of the stars. Stars is nothing but related to astrology. So one more information that I want to give you is, in ancient Greek astrology, the planets are always referred to as stars. So they're not referred to as planets, but they're referred to as stars. So growing faith in the power of the stars. So by 150 BC, people started realizing that astrology, the planets, the signs, the aspects were extremely important, and the fourfold system of astrology, that is the planet, signs, aspects, uh, it's extremely, things started developing there. So aspects, we all know that planets have scientific forms or the scientific compositions which were given by philosophers like Aristotle. And in India, we have the planetary compositions and the nature of planets and its relation to astrology in Rig Veda, and it's the same that is also there in Hellenistic region as well. But the aspectual theory or the doctrine of aspects is not as much explained in Indian astrology as it is in the Western astrology or the Greek astrology. A lot of things are mentioned about the aspects that are not in Greek astrology, but why or how a specific thing came about is extremely debatable. Not because what it is wrong, because different people have different notions, because we still don't know why Mars has the 8th aspect, which so something, this is just one example, but I'm just saying that Mars having 8th aspect is one of the things that we cannot define astronomically or geometrically or mathematically. So we need explanations to a lot of things. What I'm just saying is that all these explanations of aspect theories are well documented in the Greek and the Persian tradition more than the Indian tradition. So Nechepso and Petasaurus were the legendary figures of early documentation of horoscopic astrology in Hellenistic Egypt, which gave rise to the foundation of Hellenistic astrologers and Hellenistic astrology, and many other Hellenistic astrologies like Valens and Claudemy and many other people constantly quoted Nechepso and Petasaurus in their works. So not a lot of what Nechepso and Petasaurus survives today. I think we have like 11-page fragment that survives, which has been translated by Eduardo Gramaglia from Argentina. So which I think is available for free online. So if you want to go and check or search for Nechepso and Petasaurus, you will probably find 11 or 12-page translation. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of survival. But during those times, they may have had a lot of texts from Nechepso and Petasaurus, which probably gave rise to Hellenistic astrology. So the Greek horoscope here, the image on the right is papyrus. I really don't know what is written here because I don't read ancient Greek, and I also don't know how to read papyrus. So, but something that we know here from a website that that is linked here is that this is a Greek horoscope documented in papyrus showing the zodiacal positions, which is tentatively dated to the 4th or 5th June of 29 BC. We are essentially talking about 2000 years before, where we have recorded papyrus. Someone who reads ancient Greek can actually decode what's written here, despite the fact that there is a lot of damage that has happened to this papyrus, this fragment of papyrus. So there is not much to talk about here, but it's just, I just wanted to portray the origins of horoscopic astrology, although it is extremely controversial because various ancient traditions claim that horoscopic astrology was practiced in their tradition, like what we do. But I think we already had an existing horoscopic tradition before the Greeks, because we have Ramayana and Mahabharata that took place far before even the Greek civilization existed. So that's for a different lecture. But here we see that the Western historians conveniently chose to ignore the fact that what we had in Ramayana or Mahabharata and deny that horoscopic astrology was practiced in India before 2nd century CE, which is very shameful. And but it does not make one bit of difference or to the evidence that astrology was practiced somewhere in the 1st century BC. I mean, horoscopic astrology was practiced in 1st century BC. So, and yeah. So here is horoscopic astrology in India. This is the nativity of Lord Rama. This is a translation from, I forgot the name of the translation, but this is from a work that I acquired from Kindle version of the translation of Valmiki Ramayana. So this is a phrase where we see that it was Chaitra's month returning day, which is the Sukla Paksha Navami. The moon within that mansion, shone moon, was shining in Cancer within its own sign, which Aditi kindly looks on, where sun makes an aspect to the moon, raised to their apex in the sky. Apex is the 10th house or the mid-heaven, which is the highest point in the zodiac, or the most powerful angle. 5 brilliant planets beamed on high, 5 brilliant planets in exaltation, which is Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, Venus, and the Sun. Shone within the moon in Cancer sign, Brihaspati with light divine. It says Jupiter is in conjunction with the moon in the sign of Cancer. Kausalya bore an infant blessed with heavenly marks of grace, impressed Rama, the universe's Lord. So we don't have any information about Lord Rama's ascendant. I'm not sure where it came about, but still we at least have recorded planetary positions when Rama was born, when Lord Rama was born, which is a more than enough proof or evidence to know that horoscopic astrology was practiced in India millenniums before Greeks even existed in this world. So I just wanted to put this because India had astrology since the beginning. So next is Hellenistic astrologers. So all these astrologers, like Marcus Manilius in the 1st century CE wrote Astronomica, which is a Latin didactic poem which exists even today. We have translations. Dorotheus of Sidon from 1st century. His Greek version is not existing, but we have translations from Arabic translated by Umar al-Tubari, which was done in 7th or 8th century Persia, and we have the English translations done by David Pingree and also Benjamin Dykes. Vedius Valens' anthology is the largest and longest surviving astrological text from the Greek era of the 2nd century CE, and it was translated by Mark Riley. It's available for free online. And Claudius Ptolemy, we already spoke about Ptolemy. And Paulus of Alexandrinus lived in the 4th century. His work is called as Isagogica, which is also available as translations today, which is translated by Dorian Greenbaum. Firmicus Meternus, 4th century astrologer, who was also a lawyer, who was probably the first Christian astrologer living in the Roman world, wrote Mathesis, a treatise on astrology. Mathesis is a very interesting work where he talks about a lot of things, including extreme importance to the planet Moon. And then Rhetorius of Egypt, his name is Rhetorius, and he wrote the book called Rhetorius the Egyptian, which is also available to us in translation by James Holden. And Theophilus of Edessa is one of the most influential figures who lived in the transition of the Hellenistic and the Persian world, or the Islamic world. So he was probably a Greek who served the caliphate or an Abbasid during the wars of Islamic caliphates or Abbasids, and he was electing charts for wars, and he was doing military horary. Military horary in the sense Edessa would actually elect a chart when a particular kingdom should attack another kingdom, or when they should launch an attack on another kingdom. So it's an extremely sensitive work because it could cause anything that goes wrong, could cause massacre of thousands of people. So, and during that time, any astrologer who made a wrong prediction was killed. So we can assume that Edessa did most of the works correctly because he was electing charts for wars and horary stuff. fall of the Roman Empire. I think I'll just rush through the fall of the Roman Empire because it does not have much to do with astrology, but still it is important because Firmicus Montanus, Vettius Valens, Firmicus Montanus, and most of the Hellenistic astrologers lived through the crisis that plagued the Roman Empire for around 300 to 400 years, from 2nd century through to the 4th or the 5th century CE, where barbarians and Germanic invaders from the east and the west always bombarded the Roman kingdom. And apart from that, they also had plague, which killed thousands of people, including not just people living in the Roman civilization, but also people in the war. And hence, they did not have the resources to fight the Germanic and barbarian and also later Islamic invaders and the Persian invaders from the east. So ideally, it is fair to say that the 4th century, 4th or 5th century brought about the end. So now we have reached the stage where we will have to look at the foundation of Baghdad. So are you able to see the screen? Is everyone able to see the screen?
Yes, I'm able to see the screen.
Okay, so this is the, I'm not sure if any Westerners are here. So if in case I just put out a wheel, but I'm sure most of us can understand the South Indian and North Indian chart here. So a lot of astrologers, let's talk a little bit about Baghdad. Baghdad, after the Persian Empire was essentially over and the Islamic people or the Arabs took over Persia, they made Baghdad their capital. So when Alexandria was one of the most important cities in history of antiquity and ancient period, Iraq, Baghdad turned out to be the most important city of the preservation of scientific texts and knowledge in the medieval era, and Baghdad turned out to be the capital of the Islamic Empire. So we have the foundation chart of Baghdad, which was 31st July 762 in Baghdad. So they've chosen the Sagittarius rising with Jupiter on the ascendant, with Venus in the 7th house. But still we have this Rahu and Ketu axis in the 2nd and 8th house, which is not entirely good. And Saturn is also in a fallen condition in Aries, which is debilitated. But the good thing is they have Mars in the 6th house, and Sun is in the 9th house, which is pretty strong in Leo, along with the Moon. So some of the positives that we can take from this chart is, despite the retrogression of Jupiter in its own sign of Sagittarius is not so bad. It's very good for the survival of the city. And we see Venus in the 7th house, which means Baghdad can easily be a connectivity or the factor of union for many places in the world, because they wanted Baghdad to be a place where Islamic scientific texts were stored after translations from various parts of the world. So they wanted to have this connectivity with the 7th house, so hence Venus is there. And Sun is the most important planet when we talk about mundane astrology, especially in terms of erecting a city. We need the government to be extremely strong, and we also need the 9th house to be very strong, because they need to have the preservation of knowledge, which is the 9th house matter. So Sun and the Moon there is the beginning of all these things. But the difficulty there is the 2nd and 8th house axis of Rahu and Ketu in the 2nd and 8th house, which that is one factor. And Saturn in Aries in a fallen condition is another factor why Baghdad is still continuing to be a sensitive city where there is always some kind of bloodshed or war that's taking place. So we know what happened in the recent times. I don't want to get into all those things, but still it's one of those reasons. There is no much change between the geographical location of medieval Baghdad and modern day Baghdad. still the same city across the river Tigris. So Mars in the 6th house probably gave the strength to kind of defeat the enemies. So this is a small take that I want to talk about this chart. But if there is anything that anyone wants to say, I think they're most welcome. We can just spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about this.
Anyone want to add any points here?
Okay. So maybe we can just move.
Sure.
So now, as I said, it's important to understand that the Greeks and the Indians were masters of science and mathematics, but the Muslims were really experts in kind of bringing all the texts from various regions and translating them and giving a pattern or a sequence of the texts. And especially if you look at the medieval astrological texts that we have in English translation today, they're pretty much clear without a lot of ambiguity in the text. So the moment we read it, we just have to sync the language of astrology. But apart from that, we really don't have much problem studying the text. It's really patternized, it's really sequential, and we can really use it in practicality for client sessions. So we already spoke about the Western Roman Empire and Byzantine Empire, but that's what the Muslims really did not think, that they cannot impart or they cannot translate knowledge from other civilizations and kingdoms. They kind of preserved the texts from the Greeks, and they also connected with the Indians because we have Navamshas being spoken about in one of the medieval works written by Abu Mashar, one of the most important astrologers. This is a proof to know that they had Indian texts as well. So we already have a lot of proof saying that they have Greek texts. So that's out of question. So it turned out to be the Islamic golden age of astrology, and a lot of texts written by the Arabic authors from the 7th century through to the 10th or 11th century is pretty much available to us in some form of manuscript, or at least, if not Arabic translations, we at least have Latin translation. And we can still find a lot of translations coming out today. So some of the medieval astrologers and their works are Mashallah ibn Atari, who wrote on conjunctions, religions, and people, which is basically mundane astrology. And Mashallah also wrote treatise on nativities, which talks about astrology of people. And we have the modern day translation by James Holden. And then we have Abu Ali al-Khayat, whose Kitab al-Mawalid is called the Book of Birth. And we also have modern translation by Benjamin Dietz. I think it's Persian Nativities 1, if I'm not wrong. And Abu Mashar, the astrologer that I spoke about, he's considered to be the prince of medieval astrologers, who kind of defended astrology from a scientific phenomenon, who also integrated astrology with the Aristotelian principles of the universe and the planetary compositions. And more importantly, we don't have the knowledge of why a planet is exalted in one position, in their positions, or why a planet is debilitated in one position. So Abu Mashar kind of writes about the knowledge of planetary exaltation, which is one of the most path-breaking works of the medieval astrology, which is called as the Great Introduction to the Science of the Judgment of the Stars. So Kitab al-Mudkhal al-Kabir is one of those works, and Kitab Tahawil Sini al-Mawalid is another work which talks about the solar returns or the solar revolutions, along with various other techniques such as primary directions and Fridaria and transits and Navamshas. So it's one of the most comprehensive texts on solar return techniques, which is available to us in form of Tajika, which was inherited by the late medieval Indian astrologers in the 13th century, such as Samarasimha and then it was passed on to various other astrologers through oral tradition. It was made available to Neelakanti in the 16th century, and which we call as Tajika Neelakanti today. And we Al-Kindi, Al-Kindi, let's, for the sake of easiness, let's call Al-Kindi. So Al-Kindi was a philosopher turned astrologer who probably influenced Abu Mashar to learn and do astrology. So Abu Mashar started learning astrology only when he was 40 years old. But Al-Kindi, who was a philosopher come astrologer, actually motivated Abu Mashar, or probably challenged Abu Mashar to do astrology, which kind of gave rise to a lot of works that we have from Abu Mashar. Al-Kindi's work is called as the Book of the Judgment of the Stars, including the 40 chapters on questions and elections. Questions is called Horary, which is Prashna, and elections is Muhurta. So Sahal ibn Bishir al-Israeli has written one of the longest treatises and one of the most complete treatises on natal astrology. His work is available to us in translation by Ben Dykes. It's called The Introduction to the Science of the Judgments of the Stars. It's also translated by James Holden. And Al-Biruni, Abu Rehan Al-Biruni, we all know Al-Biruni. He was a famous historian, come polymath, come astrologer. He wrote many works, and one of those is Understanding Astrology. And Abu al-Hasan Ibn Abi al-Rijal al-Shebani is a Tunisian astrologer. Tunisia is in North Africa, modern-day North Africa. He wrote one of the most complete texts on astrology, which includes all the branches, that is elections, mundane, horary, and natal, called Kitab al-Bari fi Akam and Nujum. So it is available to us in Latin form. I'm not sure if it is available to us in Arabic, because it was originally written in Egyptian Arabic in the 11th century. So later, astrology by Sal ibn Bishir, Mashallah, Abu Mashar, Umar al-Tabari, al-Rijal, al-Kindi was all transmitted and preserved in the libraries across Europe, Western Europe, in countries such as especially Italy and Spain. So we have the works on mundane astrology, electional astrology, horary astrology, and natal astrology, which was translated into various languages, especially medieval Latin, and a little bit of astrology translated to Spanish and Italian. So this kind of turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because when we did not find out the Arabic versions, astrologers found the Latin, Spanish, and Italian versions and translated, and hence the astrology of the 12th, 13th, and 14th century was made available to us in modern era. So, so all this is essentially the history, which I will skip now because of lack of time. There is and astrologers of Latin Europe. So Roger Hereford is probably the first astrologer from the UK who wrote judicial astrology, which is called as the Roger Hereford's Judicial Astrology. So, and then his work was researched by researcher, scholar, and astrologer Chris Mitchell from the UK, and Abraham Ibn Ezra turned out to be one of the important astrologers of the 12th century, and his work is still available today in translations and is extremely important and influential even in modern era with his astrology of electional and mundane stuff. Leopold of Austria lived in the 13th century, and he gave huge basics of astronomical treatises for astrologers along with his astrology, and his work is available in translation on Amazon. And Guido Bonatti is an astronomer come astrologer and mathematician and whatnot. He has written a complete book on astrology on every branch, which is available to us in translation by Ben Dykes. It's probably a 2,500 or 3,000 page book that is divided into various parts by Ben Dykes, and he is one of the pioneering figures of medieval astrology in Europe. And Renaissance is all about the astrology in UK. So astrology was always criticized, but still it was not as criticized as it was in Renaissance tradition. So this is when astrology stopped being one single phenomenon, and it turned out to be different phenomena, because astrologers had tables to calculate the charts, and they did not have to record the planetary movements that's happening in the sky. So Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler were two major astronomers and the last of astronomers who also practiced astrology, because scientific community continued to reject astrology, and they did not accept astrology as a regular phenomenon or a scientific phenomenon. And William Lilly was one of the most important astrologers of the mid 17th century through the late 17th century, and his Christian astrology was one of the groundbreaking works, especially in horary astrology. And we have, and probably it was one of the earliest English language astrology that was written, because Roger Hereford's work was probably in Latin, but this is probably one of the most earliest astrology works written in English language, published in the 17th century England. It was famous for horary astrology, and many people follow Lilly's horary astrology even today. And around the same time, Placidus D. Titus, whose formation of house system is considered to be the Placidus house system, which is a quadrant-based quadrant division, is used even by today's Indian astrologers in KP system or Krishnamurti Paddhati. So Placidus turns out to be one of the most popular house systems in India, and Placidus turns out to be one of the important figures who actually understood the idea of Ptolemy's division of houses. Because many astrologers from the 3rd century through the 15th century misunderstood Ptolemy, including Regiomontanus, that I mentioned here, which is the house system used by Lilly. But Placidus turns out to be one of the correct astrologers who correctly understood Lilly's work. Correctly understood Ptolemy's work, and presented the perfect quadrant house division system. And other astrologers like Alcabisius, Alcabisius is a Latinized name, but I think he is an Arabic astrologer, Islamic astrologer, whose name is Al-Khabisi, who also gave his house system, which is one of the popular house system, which is called as Alcabisius house system today. And another important medieval astrologer in Renaissance Europe was Jean-Baptiste Morin of France, who wrote astrology in French language and developed astrology. His books, various books, I think he has written a lot of books, at least 10-volume books, which talks about natal astrology, horary astrology, election astrology, mundane astrology, and directions and revolutions and aspects and basic astrology of planets and signs and houses and aspects. So his books are available today. All books are available today, and he was also a mathematician and astronomer, which is a rare combination in 17th century Europe. But astrology declined in Europe after the 17th century, or probably started declining in the 17th century, because of various wrong predictions made by astrologers regarding the political happenings in Europe. Not just in England, but throughout Europe, there was a lot of mistakes that was made in political happenings, and which gave the reasons for scientific community to completely bombard and disregard astrology as a scientific phenomenon. But William Lilly was one of those astrologers who got things right, and he also found himself on the wrong side just because he got things right. If you see here, Lilly made a right prediction when he was asked the question. The question was when the death would occur, the death of one of the parliamentary leader whose name was John Pym. So Lilly answered the question saying that he assessed this looking at the moon's movements and at the planet ruling the zodiac sign at the start of the house of death, the 8th house. We all know 8th house is the house of death. In Pym's chart, the sign was Aquarius, which is ruled by Saturn. Sorry, I have to put in the Western chart because it is it's probably the Regiomontanus house system used by Lilly. It's a quadrant-based system, and no Vedic software calculates the quadrant-based system. I know some of the KP softwares does, but I'm not sure if it is the same planetary positions that we would have here. So I chose to go with the Western wheel. Let me explain here. So this is the first house, this is the second house, third house, so on and so forth. It goes in anti-clockwise manner. And one more thing in the quadrant house division is that one sign is always not equal to one house. So one sign can also have two houses, which is one of the most different things from the regular whole sign houses that we use. So if you see here, this is Leo, Cancer rising. Okay, so the Cancer rising, we have Moon in the 5th house of Sagittarius. Actually, Sagittarius for Cancer rising is the 6th house, but in quadrant divisions, we see that it actually falls in the 5th house. So Lilly considers the position of the Moon in the 5th house, and he calculates how long will it take for Moon to reach the 8th house cusp, which is here in Aquarius, and ruler of the 8th house is Saturn, which is placed in the 10th house. So, and more importantly, Saturn is placed in Aries, which is its debility. So somehow the 8th house and Saturn are related to death. So Lilly concluded that by transits, when Moon, this is a horary chart or the Prashna chart. So Lilly concluded that when Moon actually completes its movement and reaches the 8th house cusp, and when it starts being ruled by Saturn in fallen position or in debility of Aries, ruling the Aquarius, the 8th house, the death would occur. And this was predicted on 30th November 1643. And Lilly, just like Lilly predicted, John Pym actually died on 8th December of 1643, years after Lilly was questioned for the death of John Pym, because such predictions really were very sensitive during the 17th century, and some even speculated that Lilly had something to do with the death. So, so you can imagine what kind of political sensitivity that we had during the 7th century Europe. And then we have the psychological and esoteric traditions. First, we have to understand that the ancient traditional astrology was completely lost, and astrology of the 20th century in the West was completely new, and it did not have anything to do. Actually, the astrology of Lilly and Murin was very different from that of the ancient Greeks and Persians. There was a lot of differences, and there was a lot of filtrations, and astrology was not as effective or as strong as it was then, and some of the most fundamental concepts were missed from the 17th century or 16th century European transmission. And then after a lot of political turmoil, astrology was not practiced openly, although there may have been individuals like you and me who wanted astrology, who wanted astrologers to practice because we want to know things that are happening in our life. But not many people practiced freely. Although astrology was practiced, it did not flourish, and not many people practiced freely. But somewhere in the 1880s, astrology took an entirely new dimension, which was completely psychological and esoteric traditions, and we don't even know how it came about. But I think the Secret Doctrine by H.P. Blavatsky was one of the fundamental philosophical works based on which the Theosophical Society of UK during the 1880s and 1890s gave rise to another new form of astrology, which was mostly psychological and esoteric, and the predictive quotient of astrology was completely out of favor. So many astrologers like Alan Leo, Alice Bailey, two examples like Alan Leo and Alice Bailey, who practiced astrology, started integrating the idea of planets with the idea of karma and reincarnation. But I think the idea of karma and reincarnation was completely mistaken by a lot of Theosophical Society, and they kind of misrepresented the idea of karma and reincarnation, even that is out of the scope of the Secret Doctrine by H.P. Blavatsky. And astrology was diluted, astrology was non-predictive, astrology was more psychological. So, and then we have Dane Rudhyar, who's considered to be one of the most pioneering thinkers of modern astrology. also made a statement in his preface of his book called The Astrology of Personality. He said that it does not make much sense to practice a form of astrology which was practiced 2000 years ago, which is essentially the Greek form of astrology and Indian form of astrology. So he kind of gave another improvement from the already existing tradition by Alan Leo and Alice Bailey, and Mark Edmund Jones and Dane Rudyard followed them in terms of giving astrology in a far more psychological manner, which is which probably cannot be used for prediction, and was not intended to use for prediction. And another new development came from the psychiatrist from Switzerland called Carl Jung, who again whose theories were integrated in astrology, and they gave archetypal meanings for planets, and astrology was further diluted and made more psychological. And by late 60s and early 70s, or probably by late 70s as well, astrologer Jeffrey Wolf Green gave rise to another form of astrology called evolutionary astrology, which made Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto as the main planets, especially Pluto being the main planet that deals with the transformation of the soul. And they attached the idea of reincarnation with the outer planets, and then put in the nodes, which was by Stephen Forrest. He put in the nodes and gave the nodes two perspectives. One is the past life and another is the future life. And he put in the idea of reincarnation with the nodes, and the evolution of the soul with Pluto. So, but I think although there is a lot of excellent information in terms of psychological quotient of a nativity, I think the fundamental idea is in error, because there is no evolution of soul. Soul does not learn, soul does not evolve, soul does not change, because the soul is omnipresent and it does not change its state. It just has one state. It just takes change in physical form, and the physical form is the one that goes through all the changes. So his idea was completely it's in fault. So, and if you see this quote, "Let us part company with fatalistic astrologer who prides himself on his predictions and who is ever seeking to convince the world that in the predictive side of astrology alone we find its value. We need not argue the point as to its reality, but instead make a much needed change in the world and call astrology the science of tendencies," which is basically hopeless as far as I'm concerned, because when you remove the quotient of prediction or forecasting from astrology, it's not called astrology, but it's merely called psychology, or just basically talking with people. So astrology continued to be diluted until ancient astrology was again found, which is the revival of ancient medieval astrology, which silently happened in the 50s and 60s, but really took place when Project Hindsight was formed. So Project Hindsight was formed by three major astrologers, the three Roberts, called the Robert Hahn, Robert Schmidt, and Robert Zoller, who translated texts from Latin and ancient Greek, which actually began the revolution of revival of ancient astrology. And then because of the fallout between the three astrologers, Project Hindsight came to a standstill, and there was no more translations for some time. And then Benjamin Dykes almost took on the translation project, and he started doing a lot of translations from Latin and now Arabic, and he has single-handedly translated the entire Islamic tradition of astrology as far as we can know, and he's still looking forward to translate a lot more. And recently we have Levente Laszlo from Hungary, who's translating the Byzantine texts and also some of the untranslated texts from the ancient Greek and Islamic era. And I am one of the supporters of his movement, where I'm just supporting his work by contributing monetarily on a frequent basis, so that we can get some of the ancient texts that are that are lying untranslated, and we can probably revive the tradition that was rich in ancient and medieval times. So, and postmodern era, we all know where we have postmodern era. We have we have all forms of ancient astrology from Indian, Persian, and Greek civilization, but we are not having much of a renaissance in terms of revival of ancient Sanskrit tradition, as far just like the Greeks and the Persian traditions are having. So it will be great if people are willing to learn Sanskrit, but it's very hard to find texts in India. So I just hope at some point of time we will have a lot of texts that are available to us, so that we can also improve already a form of astrology, the Vedic astrology, which is already as long as an ocean. So it will be important for us to kind of grow from here and translate a lot of untranslated, many thousands of untranslated texts that are lying across the libraries in India. So with this, I think it's the end of the presentation. Sorry for taking half an hour of everyone's time, because I wanted to just run through a little bit of things that but still I thought that it is important to kind of give a little bit of an overview instead of running through. And anyone who wants the PPT can appropriately have through Mr. Muthu Vijayan Ilango. So that I'm not sure if it is shared, but if anyone wants it, you can contact him. Or if it is appropriate, anyone can contact me through my email. It's more than available to you. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and I hope everyone had a reasonably good session in terms of having an overview in terms of history of astrology in the in west of Indian subcontinent.
Definitely, Ashwin. Thank you so much for a wonderful session. It was like traveling along with you in a time machine to go past and see like how the astrology has evolved all over the world. So that's a really interesting session. I have learned a lot of things actually today. So it's really good. So if anybody have any questions, we can take it up now. I think one Shri Vidya asked one question in the comment section. Is tarot trading related to astrology? Yeah, she asked that.
Is tarot related to astrology? I heard that both tarot cards have an astrological basis. Tarot is astrology is an art of divination, and more than science and mathematics, astrology is also an art of divination, and horary astrology is one of the perfect testimonies of why we call astrology as an art of divination. Just like astrology, tarot is just another art of divination, but and it is useful to have the knowledge of astrology if you already know tarot, or if you are learning tarot, because it is easy to integrate astrology with tarot and provide tarot readings. But it's not that we cannot give a standalone tarot reading, because tarot is more of a pictorial representation and a symbolic representation, which is almost as good as what Babylonians and Assyrians did just by looking at the image. So if I take out an image from my pocket, and if I have, let's say, I have a blank paper when I take out from my pocket, thinking of something, so it means that I won't have an answer for a particular question that I have for a very long period. So the tarot is just like that in terms of finding out answers that universe gives us through a picture for that particular moment. So tarot is not necessarily related to astrology, but you can relate tarot with astrology and see how useful it is for you to employ in modern day practice. But I know many people who employ tarot along with their astrology. So tarot can be definitely related with astrology, but is it related to astrology? Probably not, because both of them have their own individual stance, and astrology can be practiced without tarot, and tarot can be practiced without astrology. But if you can already integrate it, it's even better.
Thank you very much.
No problem. In the Western world, since when and why Christians and Islamic? Yeah, okay. Thanks for asking. It's a brilliant question because I wanted to touch it while talking, but I think I forgot. See, Christians, since the advent of Christianity, somewhere after the Common Era in 3rd or 4th century, Christianity started kind of dismissing astrology as a scientific phenomenon because Christianity employed free will. Christianity is all about free will, and it's not about determinism. But if you ask a Vedic astrologer, or if you ask a traditional Greek astrologer or Persian astrologer, he wants to know a story. When I invest in market today, will I get profit or will I be facing loss? It's a very objective question that most people want an answer to. But Christians thought that that's against the idea of fundamental Christianity. So they kind of dismissed astrology as a scientific phenomenon, and astrology was prohibited in most of the churches. And Islam, this is the story of astrology in Christian. Especially, I talked about Julius Firmicus Maternus, who was one of the lawyers and astrologers in the 4th century. He practiced astrology, and later it is believed that he converted to be a Christian. But once he converted into Christianity, we never know whether he actually gave up astrology or whether he wrote more texts in astrology. The only text that we have from Firmicus Maternus is Mathesis. So probably after converting to Christianity, he did not have much to do with astrology, and he gave up the practice and study of astrology. What happened with Islam was, somewhere in the 11th or 12th century, all these predictions, especially mundane and political events, created a lot of unrest in the 11th and 12th century Islamic Middle East and medieval Europe. So the Muslims banned astrology and prohibited it by calling it as black magic, and they considered that knowing things before happening is a sin according to Islamic philosophy. So they kind of busted astrology out of their tradition, and it was stopped. And one thing that I don't understand is the abrupt stoppage of practice and transmission of astrology by both Christians and Islam, because it was so strict during those days that they just gave up completely, which also gave rise to the loss of texts, especially to the medieval Latin astrologers or the late medieval Latin astrologers from 15th, 16th, and 17th century, and they had diluted forms of astrology, and they lost a lot of fundamental concepts and techniques that were used with the early Hellenistic and Greek astrology. So it's that is basically what I have to talk about. Prohibition of astrology from Christian and Islamic cultures. Does Eastern astrology have any similarities with the West, the 12 animals of the zodiac? Obviously, we have some kind of pictorial representation in animals with the zodiac in most forms of astrology, and it is also evident in Indian astrology because Indian astrology from the 2nd and 3rd century through Yavana Jataka, and also the existing forms of nakshatras, indigenous astrology from Indian tradition, which is the nakshatra based astrology, was transmitted from India to ancient China, where another new religion developed. So in those texts that were transmitted from India to China and Japan, there were images of animals and various pictorial representations for various signs and various nakshatras as well. So all this is not new, and it already existed. And for your information, traditional astrology to China was started, the transmission started from the 7th century and the 8th century during the Tang dynasty of China, and some of the texts, one of the texts that actually made through was Dorotheus of Sidon's text, which was written in the 1st century, which is a Greek text. It got transmitted to translated into Arabic, and finally in the 7th and 8th century, due to various give and take between the Chinese and the Persians, a lot of texts were transmitted to China, and because of that, China had a growth of flourish of astrology for many years, which is continuing till today. So astrology has always been identified by images and pictures. I recommend everyone to read Yavana Jataka, because if you read Yavana Jataka, you will have various signs represented with various images for the decans or the Drakanas. So and the same goes with nakshatras, and it's common across Eastern astrology, Western astrology, and one more thing is there was no Western astrology. Astrology in the West is basically the diluted forms of esoteric and psychological astrology, because everything was found in Hellenistic Egypt and Persia. And Persia stood an interesting middle ground in the history by being in the middle of both Greeks and the Indians, which made it easier for the give and take. And it was a perfect triangle that formed between the Persia, India, and Greece, which made the transmission of scientific, not just astrological texts, but also the scientific texts from various regions, and probably one of the reasons why we still have a lot of texts today. I hope I answered the questions.
Okay. Yeah. So anybody else have any other question?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks
People enjoyed
everyone for joining, and thanks everyone to this banner of Innovative Astro Solution for inviting me, and also for enabling such a platform for spreading the knowledge of Jyotish and various other forms of astrology, which is very essential. Can we have any forecast about the current pandemic? So I think most of the people will have wrong forecast about the pandemic, because many people suggested that the pandemic will be over. But I'm not a great mundane astrologer, but at least if there is if sanity prevails, and if non-astrological and practical information through mathematical models is to be believed, I think we will be. I hope India will go through some of this for at least 1 month until the peak goes, and I hope things will start declining by June and July, and progressively throughout the year. But I think most of it kind of comes to us in terms of being safe. So I hope each and every one of your families, including yourself, stay safe during this very terrible times that we are living through. And I think Innovative Astro Solutions is giving that platform for everyone to at least not go out and be exposed for 1.5 to 2 hours a month, which is a great thing. So if 20 people attend this, we have 40 hours saved, and it's surely saving human lives. So thank you very much for doing this, and thanks everyone for being part of this.
Thank you, Ashwin. Thank you so much. Okay, if there are any other questions, we'll take. Otherwise, we'll close the call. Thank you so much for everyone for joining this and making it interactive.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwin. We had a very nice session. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you for joining.